If you turned around to most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and said, suddenly the province is going to become the gateway of power to Europe, I think there would be an interest there because there's a thinking that's so used to the idea of everything going the other way.
Interconnector that would go beyond, well beyond the borders of the European Union and for that matter, Great Britain, but go all the way to North America. We've seen other projects like this proposed. One has been proposed, I should say, between Singapore and Australia, which I believe is 4,800 kilometers. So it's about the same length as what's been proposed by Laurent. It's very attractive for several reasons. Let's just put it this way. It's really sunny in Europe in the middle of the day, and they are spilling or they are curtailing some of their solar. They're just shutting off the equipment because they can't use it. But guess what? It's 6 o'clock in the morning in northeastern North America. And when we're getting up and flipping on our coffee machines and, whatever, our AC in summer, we need that power. And so that's just an example, but there's a lot of benefits to trading energy back and forth across the ocean. And then the other reality is there's seasonal benefits as well. Capital expenditure required for that intercontinental connector is gargantuan. So he's saying it'll be a 30 billion euro project. And I think that that's shocking for a lot of people. But when you start to think about the investments that Canada has recently made in, like, for instance, the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, suddenly you're kind of in the ballpark. It's got a lot of attractive qualities from a reliability standpoint. And then, some senior high voltage direct current experts have said this is technically feasible. There's no scientific red flag.
Like, I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. This is a problem, right? They're looking at building out offshore wind. We actually have an offshore wind coordinator at the club who's
Yes.
working with us now. The biggest thing with that is how do you export that energy, right? And there's been
Right.
insights into, ammonia and everything, but this has always been historically an issue for the province. How do you export energy? And when you're talking about that comparison to, like, say, Trans Mountain, the idea of shipping it somehow, those are actually like shipping it, building pipelines. These are huge logistical hurdles. And I always find it funny that, like, then you hear, like, oh, why not just literally put a power cable there?
The cable that Laurent is proposing, NATO L, it would certainly be bidirectional, and the bidirectionality of it would dramatically heighten its attractiveness for investors and in terms of benefits to consumers. Again, like this example of an intercontinental interconnector, means you could ship those electrons overseas. So yeah, should Newfoundland look at that? Of course. This is one of Laurent's proposed landing points. Your home province's entire political spectrum would be interested in seeing a lot of these workers come back from Western Canada that are working in the oil patch or other industries and working on offshore wind development. It's a great career. These are high-paying jobs. This is wealth-generating infrastructure that works. It has high capacity factor that's well tested all over the world.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada and sometimes elsewhere by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Director of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and your host today. Today I'm going to be talking to Philip Duguay about the prospect and proposal, effectively, for a power cable to run from North America to Europe, potentially landing in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it's an interesting proposal. It would obviously open up a lot of opportunities in terms of renewable energy. It is something that would require a fairly steep investment, but it is something that also seems to have a lot of potential practicality and backing when compared to some of the other ways in which we talk about shipping energy. And since recently, we have been having a lot of discussions about pipelines. We've been having a lot of discussions about shipping energy in the form of oil and gas. I felt it was interesting to chat to Philip about a totally different way of shipping energy, and to be honest, a much more practical way that more matches the energy of the future when we're talking about wind and solar power. Now, Philip and I disagree on a number of points. Number one being hydropower. I don't see it as green. Philip does. One place where we do agree is on the need for stronger grid infrastructure and more interconnections, whether that's across Canada or potentially to Europe. So it's an interesting discussion on that. Now, we had this conversation in late November 2025. It's now February 2026. A lot has changed since we had this discussion even, and things will probably continue to evolve. But I do want you to keep in mind that when we're talking about energy, the cheapest forms of power that we are seeing are solar and wind. And increasingly what we are finding is as soon as we have the grid infrastructure to transport energy to a location using electricity rather than oil and gas or LNG, solar and wind tend to end up taking on a huge role in that because they are such a cheap way to create energy. And there is a real role here for solar, wind, and battery storage, and some really interesting potential connections between work that is already being done in Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly, but across Canada, and what could be done to grow out that, to my mind, truly renewable grid. Before we begin today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on our homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hobbit Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. So thanks for joining me today. For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
Thanks, Connor. And thanks to Sierra Club for their interest in the topic. My name is Philip Duguay, and I work as an independent consultant. I'm 100% focused on interregional transmission projects. So that's long-haul power transmission projects that span between different jurisdictions, or what we in the power sector call balancing authorities. So balancing authority is a body that is responsible basically for keeping the lights on in a specific jurisdiction. In Canada, almost uniformly, each province is its own balancing authority, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, which is actually part of the New Brunswick system operator. So those two provinces have a conjoined grid, if you will, from a balancing authority perspective. In the United States, the balancing authority picture is quite different. There are some states that have their own balancing authority, like New York State, California. These are some of the largest economies in the world. So they have their own balancing authority. But then if you look at New England, there's 6 states there, and they have one balancing authority called ISO New England. That's just an example. But there's some really large balancing authorities like MISO and SPP, which actually have Canadian members and then go all the way down to basically the border of Texas. So yeah, it's a strange, heady brew of regulatory soup that a developer has to look at when trying to span between these balancing authorities. But there's a lot of emphasis on this today, and I think this will interest your listeners. And that's because if you want to have a grid that accommodates a lot of renewables, you need to have grid systems that are larger than weather systems. Because if there's any kind of interference in solar, or if it's a low water year, or if it's not windy, offshore one day and you're trying to move energy around from other places, you got to have the grid to do it. That's my focus.
It's interesting because we do talk a lot on the show about like building out smarter grids, having a North American grid that is actually connected across Canada, being able to transfer power if it's windy in one place to another place where maybe it isn't windy or sunny that day, and having, better battery storage and everything. And specifically, I wanted to chat to you because I know you've been looking into, or I guess commenting on this idea for a project that would be basically a transmission line from North America and the northeast coast to either the UK, Europe, somewhere in the North Sea, which is kind of an ambitious idea. I'm curious, can you speak a little bit to where this project came from and what the benefits might be if it were to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. It's super ambitious. I just have to clarify for the listeners, I have no formal relationship with the proponents of the project, but you're speaking about the North Atlantic Transmission 1 link. So there's a group of financiers and developers based in the UK. There's really 2 proponents who are the leaders. It's Laurent Ségalin, who runs a company called Megawatt X, And there's a fellow named Simon Ludlam who runs a firm called Achia. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I apologize to Simon if I'm incorrect. And Simon in particular is a very experienced developer. So he's built 2 HVDC lines in salt water and is in the process of developing a third. So Europeans have a very wonderful civilization, which extends all the way to a field of regulatory thought practice called interregional transmission planning. So if you look at the European Union, yeah, they have joint markets for ag, for autos, for, every type of product you can think of, but they have a joint market for power. What they do is they plan as if there were no silos. So they have actually this body called the ENSO-E, and ENSO-E has 40 different transmission system operators, TSOs, who are members, and they come from 36 different nations. And so they have this process, what's called projects of common interest, where if a project touches multiple, or it could be 2 or more participating TSOs, it can benefit from, and there's, there's a bunch of criteria that need to be fulfilled, but that project can benefit from basically preferential financing terms from the European Commission. And so this was going on for more than a decade when the war in Ukraine broke out. But when that war broke out, I think everybody in Europe started thinking a lot differently about infrastructure development. And then all of a sudden, this projects of common interest framework, or PCI framework, kicked into high gear. And so Laurent, again, just a colleague of mine, I can call him, someone with whom I've corresponded for a couple of years. He said that when that invasion happened, he immediately came up with the idea for an interconnector that would go well beyond the borders of the European Union, and for that matter, Great Britain, but go all the way to North America. We've seen other projects like this proposed. I hope I'm being polite to Laurent and Simon. I call it a concept at this phase. It's not, to me, it's not a project yet. Project has a lot more definition, but it's a very alluring concept. These types of long range, high voltage direct current, or what's called HVDC interconnectors, have been proposed between Morocco and the United Kingdom. One has been proposed, I should say, between Singapore and Australia, which I believe is 4,800 kilometers. So it's about the same length as what's been proposed by Laurent. So it's very attractive for several reasons, but the main reason is longitudinal differences in terms of patterns of consumption and Earth's energy. So let's just put it this way. It's really sunny in Europe in the middle of the day, and they are spilling, or they are curtailing some of their solar. They're just shutting off the equipment because they can't use it. But guess what? It's 6 o'clock in the morning in northeastern North America. And when we're getting up and flipping on our coffee machines and, whatever, our AC in the summer, we need that power. And so that's just an example, but there's a lot of benefits to trading energy back and forth across the ocean. And then the other reality is there's seasonal benefits as well. Yeah, Simon and Laurent and their colleagues have started to analyze this and are conducting studies and outreach. They're in a very, very early phase. So maybe I'm jumping ahead too far here, but my critique of the project is that the provinces here in the east of Canada do not have any kind of policy tool set with which to analyze and address a proposal like this. I think your listenership will remember the failed Atlantic Loop process that the government of Canada and the eastern provinces, Quebec, I believe it was primarily Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick who were involved. We have a really difficult time building east-west transmission in Canada. And so my basic advocacy point is, hey, let's build a tool set together and start to analyze these scenarios. And Laurent and this proposal for a NATO-L project, should definitely be one of them. Why not run it through the hopper, so to speak, and see what the benefits could be? The CapEx, the capital expenditure required for that intercontinental connector, is gargantuan. So he's saying it'll be a 30 billion euro project. And I think that that's shocking for a lot of people. But when you start to think about the investments that Canada has recently made in, like, for instance, the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, suddenly you're kind of in the ballpark, and you're talking about a 6,000 megawatt interconnector that basically would operate almost like a baseload facility, that could provide a lot of energy. So if you think about 6,000 megawatts, that's NATO-L's conceptual capacity. You're basically talking about La Grande Complexe in northern Quebec, one of the largest dams in the world. And then the energy that would be transferred, it could be, anything could flow into the North Sea because they have a really robust grid, that's emerging there.
Mm-hmm.
But it would certainly be a lot of offshore wind, but it could be hydro from Norway. It could be onshore wind. It could be solar from Spain, can transit through the European grid to an offshore collector system and then over to North America. So it's ambitious, yes. I'll say that it's got a lot of attractive qualities from a reliability standpoint. And then, some senior high voltage direct current experts have said this is technically feasible. There's no scientific red flag that an interconnector of that length, approximately, I think 4,700 kilometers, will work.
Yeah.
There will be line losses. We can talk more about what that means, but.
Well, and so I'm curious as well, are we also talking about power flowing from North America to Europe during, it's nighttime in Europe? North America, though it's daytime, they're generating power. I mean, we're talking about opening up grids, it seems, in both places to being able to build out a lot of different types of renewables like solar and wind, things we haven't necessarily built out as much of. And to be fair, like, I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. This is a problem, right? They're looking at building out offshore wind. We actually have an offshore wind coordinator at the club who's
Yes.
working with us now. The biggest thing with that is how do you export that energy, right? And there's been insights into, ammonia and everything, but this has always been historically an issue for the province. How do you export energy? And when you're talking about that comparison to, like, say, Trans Mountain, the idea of shipping it somehow, those are actually like shipping it, building pipelines. These are huge logistical hurdles. And I always find it funny that, like, then you hear, like, oh, why not just literally put a power cable there, right? Like,
yeah.
And yeah, it's a big investment, but you forgo a lot of the other logistical problems you're going to deal with anyway.
Yeah. So in terms of, let's just like take the example of NATO-L, but bear in mind that NATO-L is, you could say, an extreme example of interregional transmission.
Yeah.
If I could use that expression. So Newfoundland and Labrador has a huge potential for offshore wind, onshore wind. And, I'm sure many of your listeners have, different viewpoints about large scale hydro reservoirs and the impacts that makes. And I think, like, all these things need to be considered. I'm not trying to dismiss that. With that being said, the cable that Laurent is proposing, NATO-L, it would certainly be bidirectional, and the bidirectionality of it would dramatically heighten its attractiveness for investors and in terms of benefits to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, 100%. Let's imagine we saw, just, I forget when it was, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, Hydro-Quebec had such wet weather that it was actually spilling energy. So it was spilling water over the what's called a spillway at their Grand Complexe dam because they just simply had too much water. Now, you could see that as just, oh, okay, that's just like, let's open the water gates and let it go. But you're actually giving up an economic use of that power to create non-emitting electrons for our society. If there was an interconnector to Europe, we never would have spilled that water. We would have generated the power and we would have shipped it, to the North Sea nations. And that would have, been a wonderful economic benefit to Quebec and also to the Europeans, constantly looking for these non-emitting electrons on their grid.
Again, on the make a hydro thing, agree to disagree on that. But again, I'm just thinking offshore wind power. I'm thinking onshore wind power. I'm thinking solar. I'm thinking
sure. And don't forget demand side management. Yeah. So, DSM, demand side management, is vastly underexplored in our society. So these are also like types of issues that an interregional planning body or some type of collectivity of provinces could look at this, and they could launch like a conjoined market for demand side management. And the market could be like in Quebec right now, we have ILO, or high-low, I think is in English. ILO is basically using different devices at the household level or at the industry level, a large consumer level, to create more flexible demand, flexible loads, as we say in the industry. And so that's actually marketable, because if you're a huge plant of some type that's consuming a lot of electricity and you're able to ramp down, well, guess what? We can consume those electrons here on a very cold day where we want to keep everybody warm and safe and keep the lights on. B, we can ship it down to New York City via our cables, or the existing grid that's already there, or Boston or Ontario. And so again, like this example of an intercontinental interconnector means you could ship those electrons overseas. So yeah, should Newfoundland look at that? Of course. This is one of Laurent's proposed landing points. So he wants to run a 3 cable array across the ocean, and those 3 cables would need 3 distinct converter stations on North American soil or offshore. So it could be that you'd have an onshore converter station on the island of Newfoundland. It could be that you would run a cable to the coast of Labrador and then go onshore overhead to a very robust place on the grid where you can interconnect. There are also, in Europe right now, there are an increasing prevalence of offshore HVDC converter stations. And so they're basically on what to the layperson would look like an oil and gas platform. They're very large facilities. I heard someone recently say they're like the size of a soccer pitch. So they have impacts, just like everything else that generates energy in our society has impacts. So these things need to be studied. But the good thing about transmission versus some of the alternatives that are discussed today in terms of like generation, so like there's a huge, let's say, bandwagon of support for SMRs today, small modular reactors. And I know what most of your listenership thinks about that. And I really, truly, I'm just not going to talk about that. I have no opinion on SMRs, but the truth is the SMR campaign is an R&D campaign right now, research and development. It's not a known product. Like, we don't actually know how much it costs. And so we'll find out, I think, quite shortly, because, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and OPG are financing, and I believe the province of Ontario are financing the build of said SMRs right now. But I can tell you that as a transmission developer, we can point to transmission projects and have pretty good cost certainty, because transmission is deployed all over the world. And so this is kind of another one of my main rallying cries, is the grid in and of itself is worth its own policies. It's worth its own set of regulatory efforts that, are distinct for the grid. And the grid is kind of like the lowest common denominator, because everyone from an SMR proponent to conventional generators that may or may not be crown corporations, we all have an interest in the grid. And a lot of emphasis is being placed on grid build out for various reasons in Canada right now. But we do not have any form of interregional planning process between the provinces. And so as a proponent of these projects, I want to see this happen, because it'll decrease risk for investment, which needs to go into the grid, whether that investment is from private dollars, public dollars. Like my opinion is it'll probably have to be both. But the reality is we just don't have a kind of framework to pursue this style of ambitious project, whether that's an interconnector between Newfoundland and the United Kingdom, whether that's an offshore collector system from Nova Scotia that could feed power into Quebec or Boston. So I think that, I've been kind of like, yelling from the rooftops for like a decade right now on these issues. And it's nice to see that there's finally some acknowledgement that, okay, this is a key issue. I still haven't actually seen the Carney government put its finger on that issue of interregional transmission planning, but they do seem very open to new suggestions on how to get things done. And so I'll be like in a totally optimistic manner, I'll be kind of addressing that in the coming months and years, I hope, both as a project proponent, but also as a policy advocate.
Funny you bring that up because, again, I do think we have this conception. We see the government putting a lot of money into SMRs. We see the government putting a lot of energy into oil and gas infrastructure, which often comes with its own uncertainties. But there's this sort of problem-solving mentality that tends to come with those things of, yeah, there are obstacles, but we're going to overcome them. And it's funny how much when you talk about the grid or renewables, it's like the problem solving sometimes goes out the window, and it's actually where we need it. Like in terms of the future of energy, we need that same, okay, maybe there are issues. As you say, it's not like, a transmission line is not going to have logistical hurdles, but you need to look at those as how do we overcome them, not hurdles as in this kills this project because, oh, it's not the easiest thing on the planet to do. But it's funny how much, like, as you say, for the grid, when we talk about the grid, when we talk about renewables, it feels a bit like there's a bit of a double standard there. I don't know if you find the same thing.
Well, okay. So first and foremost, we in Canada should know the delineation of roles here. And so really this is up to the provinces in terms of our constitution.
Yeah.
So the federal government has the power of the purse and the power of convening, first and foremost. The late Jim Carr, who was the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, basically during the earlier half of the Trudeau era, was someone who really took the time to master the file. And he undertook this, I'll call it an interregional planning process, except that it was quite closed door. There was no kind of industry feedback loop as part of the process, but it was called REXI. I'm sorry that I don't actually remember the acronym. I think it was, what was it? Renewable Energy and Strategic Infrastructure Initiative. I'm forgetting what the C was.
All acronyms. Coming from an environmental policy background myself, I become I get in the soup as well of it.
Yeah, well, my late boss always called it. He always called it rusty.
Rusty. Okay.
Because this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to fix up a rusty grid. But REXI basically had a Western process and an Eastern process, and then I think there was some quiet discussions between Ontario and Quebec, which was kind of a central Canadian process. And so it analyzed some scenarios. Were I able to participate in it, I might have given some different scenarios to look at. That's why I say I don't think it was a true interregional planning process, because it didn't have a feedback loop or kind of transparent angle to it. The federal government got burnt, I think, by that process. But burnt, I just mean it didn't deliver much. And they started to realize how hard it is, how the provinces really need to be the central players. And so what we saw with subsequent natural resource ministers, mostly Mr. Wilkinson, again, brilliant guy. I think, as a clean tech investor, that was his prior career. I think he understood a lot of the issues, but they just started focusing on kind of peppering subsidies across the country to renewable energy projects, because that was what they could do. They couldn't build the connective tissue that was required, but they could build strong organs, I guess, if I could use that analogy. I give credit where it's due. I mean, they did propel a lot of good initiatives forward, especially a lot of initiatives with co-equity roles for First Nations, which is great. The problem long term is that potentially this will kind of hurt price signals, which again might harm long-term investment. And now I'm going to go back to your question about Newfoundland and the role for some of these smaller provinces. And by small, I really mean population-wise. If you look at Europe, tiny little Scotland, which has, I think, 6 million people, and the UK is about 60 million total. Scotland produces like 20% of the UK's energy or more. And they're also now the beneficiary of these interconnectors with other European nations. So even though they're not in the EU anymore, they're still part of actually ENSOE, and they're still part of the European electricity market. And so Scotland, basically has this booming industry. of onshore, offshore wind, and then their hydro assets are more valuable than ever. And so I see a similar role for the Atlantic Canadian provinces, basically. If they were to band together and plan as if there were no silos, they could attract a lot of capital. They could build a lot of offshore, let's just use offshore wind as the example, offshore wind, and they could export those electrons. Long term, the US market is going to be a great place to ship those electrons. Quebec after 2035 is going to have a lot more decarbonizing to do. And so eventually they're going to have to start evaluating options offshore or outside of their own borders. And I think Newfoundland could be there, and the other maritime provinces could be there as potential sources of supply. And then, why not look at intercontinental interconnector? I guess my point is, and maybe I should have led with this, like the provinces, these quote unquote smaller provinces, like they should all become experts in interregional transmission planning. They have more skin in the game than Quebec or Ontario right now because they have more to gain, simply put. And geography has kind of placed them at the edge of Canada, so to speak, but they could start playing a much more central role in shaping the energy future. And I think something that your listenership would be, and frankly, your home province's entire political spectrum would be interested in seeing a lot of these workers come back from Western Canada that are working in the oil patch or other industries and send them back out to sea where their grandfathers and grandmothers worked and working on offshore wind development. It's a great career. These are high paying jobs. This is wealth generating infrastructure that works. It has high capacity factor that's well tested all over the world. Yeah, we can do a lot.
Well, and so I was going to actually chat on that note because one, I don't think if you turned around to most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and said suddenly the province is going to become the gateway of power to Europe, I think there would be an interest there because there's a thinking that's so used to the idea of everything going the other way. The other thing too is, I'm just thinking Memorial University, for instance, right? We've got a research institution that specializes in major offshore projects. They have a campus in England, funnily enough, as well, just outside of London. There's a huge number of tradespeople in the province who specialize in putting this sort of infrastructure in. I mean, a bit of a modification because it used to offshore oil and gas, but similar North Atlantic conditions.
Listen, I have a friend who is from Newfoundland, from the Rock, and he is a very highly experienced diver who does all this underwater welding work. And he's working off the coast of Nigeria or in the Emirates, literally all over the world, India. He would love to come home and work in Newfoundland and work on building offshore infrastructure for his home province. I mean, like there's no question that there's a huge amount of interest in this sector.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.